Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or your friends would be interested in coming on the show and chatting with me, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin, or you can reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin at fosandon.org. I'm looking forward to this conversation today. My coffee is almost empty, but I'm pretty amped up anyway. This is somebody that I've known for a long time. They're, a juggernaut in my opinion in the .NET space and just the general like open source kind of community space in general. And I'm really looking forward to talking with them and for a lengthy amount of time about kind of what their interests are in tech. So my guest today is Joe Guadagno. I kind of one of the things that I love to get to know too is I love hearing about origin stories. Like, when did you realize that tech was like the thing for you? Like, when did you like, was it, early on when you were a kid, you got some of our guests have had like CDs by mail or, getting on BBS and all those sort of different things. And some folks also got started later in career, right? When did technology introduce itself to you, Joe?
So mine kind of started, it was a progression all throughout my teenage years. I started in kind of junior high school, the seventh, eighth, ninth grades. My friend and I at the time used to go to Radio Shack on a regular basis. And I know that's now dating myself because Radio Shacks aren't a thing
Sure, sure,
unless
sure.
you watch unless you watch Stranger Things, but that's the generation I grew up in. We used to go to a store and we got blueprints for building a computer. So we started buying the parts, and this was way back before there were motherboards and memory chips and cards. You literally had a PCB board that was straight copper that you had to etch out yourself with everything. So it took us about 2 years, but we finally built a prototype for a PC. This is back in the TRS-80 days. And I kind of fell in love with it there, and that took me to the next step, which is funny you mentioned it, bulletin boards. I actually got
Yeah.
started with quick BBS for a while and had one of the two or top three bulletin boards in New York City where I grew up. It was great. I remember my first PC purchase that I had to do to operate it. It was, I think I had spent close to $3,000 way back then. And this was like in the mid 80s. It had
Sure.
two CD-ROM drives, which were awesome because I can load up, almost a gig of shareware at the time. And I had so much traffic that I had two lines coming into a house and I tried to get four lines. And the local phone company at the time, whether it was Bluebell, Verizon, or what have you, said that they couldn't add more than two lines to my house because only businesses get more than that. And a household doesn't need more than two lines. So took a while
That's
to explain it,
okay.
but eventually I had to move the business out, to a commercial office so that I can get four phone lines. But the real kicker that got me started into computers and computer programming was I had a job at a store called, I think it was called Computer World. It was like a CompUSA micro center that sold computer parts and software. They specialize in them in Macs mostly. I had a regular client of mine that came in that owned a real estate company. And he came in and said, "Hey, Joe, I need someone to write a program for me. Do you know anyone that could?" I was like, "Well, what do you need?" I was like, "Well, I'm in real estate, so I need something to track my apartments when they're coming up for lease. So I can reach out to the landlord, see if they want to find a new tenant, a
Mm-hmm.
listing of all my houses that are currently on the market, when they sold, etc. Kind of like a modern day, MLS or something to that effect." So I told the guy, I was like, "Sure, I know someone I can do it." He's like, "Great,
Yeah.
when can you start?" I was like, "Well, I guess 2 weeks." So I go home that night to my girlfriend at the time and said, "Guess what? I got a new job." And she's like, "Doing what?" I'm like, "Writing a program for a real estate company." She's like, "You know nothing about computer programming." It's like, "I know, I got 2 weeks to figure it out."
Well, yeah, yeah.
So we went to her library at the time, Hofstra University, and we took out a couple of books. And I spent 2 weeks reading those books. I showed up day one in on a Monday and said, "What do you need?" He's like, "Well, I want to do this, this, and this." Open up the book, started typing code. Open up the book, started typing code, and that was basically my origin story. After that, I progressed on in different software programming jobs since
Yeah.
then. But that was my original start, basically lying on a job interview.
Did you get the itch? Like, did you recognize that, you kind of do whatever you want, like
Yep.
as a computer programmer or as in tech, right? Was that kind of something, or maybe, like some people are just like, oh, this is a pretty quick way to make money. I have some skills in this area. Like, was it a little bit of both? Was it like, I'm enjoying it, so I might as well keep sticking at it?
For me, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
We got a lot of satisfaction in doing it. One of my cousin had a Commodore 64 that I remember one time had he was running Battleship and he had a tape drive at the time, which was
Mm.
very rare. And something happened in the application and it stopped and went to the tape drive, like basically their version of a DOS command. And I started fiddling around to see what I can do in it. I ultimately ended up changing the name from Battleship to Jamming Ship because I took the 6 characters that was word battle and I found it in the equivalent of Notepad and changed the hex codes to match JAMMIN because that used to be my DJ handle. And I was able to change it so every time my cousin played the game, it always had jamming ship, and he hated that because he was my DJ partner. I was like, my game should have my name on it, not your name. And that's kind of when I really caught the bug and was just loved the challenge of being able to figure out how things work, break them, and try to fix them.
We're not gonna get away. Like, you're not gonna be able to just throw away like the DJ stuff. Like, no, you don't get to. Let's talk about that a little bit. So, one, like, what was it about like DJing that made you want to, like? Because I mean, being a DJ, especially like, in the beginning of like DJs, it was not like something where, like, it was not super accessible from like a money perspective. You had to buy a bunch of stuff, right? And you had to buy a
Yes,
bunch
it
of, and
was
you had to buy records. Like, I think that's like lost in a lot of people now, is like DJs don't have, you know, access to the entire
crates and
spot.
crates.
Yeah, well,
You
access
know,
to the entire Spotify catalog, right?
yeah,
When they do stuff, right? You have to have actual records. So what was it about
yeah.
DJing? And I have a next question as a follow up for that too.
I think it was a lot of the creativity. It was,
Yeah.
problem solving of getting one song to blend
Yep.
with another song to be able to do that, and then having people dance and react. It was, almost a instant gratification when you
Yeah.
can play songs and see people dance. But you're right, it was very expensive. It started off with just 2 cheap turntables and a couple of records, the old vinyl
Yep.
33 and a third. I still have a collection of about 700 of them in my
Mm.
garage because I kept a lot of it, but it got very expensive. So I'd buy, very basic, kind of like photography. You buy entry level until you start getting
Yep.
more into it. Then you buy it a little bit more prosumer, and then as you get more advanced, you buy the top of the line. So by the time I by the time I started getting really good at it was towards the end of high school and into college, where I had Technique 1200s. I had a Sony amplifier. I think it was a Techniques mixing table. And I had these massive, massive speakers that weighed like 400 pounds, it felt like, but they were to provide bass and
Yeah.
tremble throughout. And it was a great time. The challenge was loading and unloading cars because you needed a
Yeah.
big car to carry,
Yeah.
we had 12 milk crates of music. Nowadays, all you need is a laptop and a small little turntable and or a small little CD looking turntable and you're good to go.
Yeah. I have so many questions. So like, I sorry that I'm gonna derail this. So like, so first question is, um, can you today? And this is kind of a two part question. When you hear songs that have the same BPM,
Yep.
do you immediately start to mix them in your head? That's the first question. And then the second
Yep.
question that I have from that is, like, to you, as somebody that worked very, very much in this analog music world, when like how painful is it for you when you hear music that is like very compressed, like digitally altered compressed music? Let's start there.
So the first one is yes. I definitely, even if it's close for the beats per minute, that was BPM stood for. I can picture in my head how I can slow down one or speed up another to get them
Mm-hmm.
in sync if it makes sense. My biggest thing was always to put different words on different beats, meaning song lyrics from one song on
Yeah.
beats of another, and try to get them together. Uh, I do listen to lots of mashups or blends, as they're called now. Sometimes I'm a huge fan, but sometimes like, oh my God, that DJ was terrible, or that mix
Yeah.
was terrible. Look what he did here or she did here, and they got things together. As far as the sound, it depends on how badly compressed it is. Like
Yeah.
I only listen to high def stuff on my Amazon Music subscription or Spotify or what have you. So
Mm-hmm.
I've never really listened to the compressed ones. But I remember when the WMA and MP4 formats first came out, and there was the quote unquote lossless compression,
Yep.
but it wasn't
Yep.
really lossless because you
Sure.
can, if you had an ear for it, you can hear that they stripped out some of the bass or some of the tremble from it or changed the acoustics of the voice.
Yeah, no, so I'm big on mashups too. I think so people that have ADHD, like I've talked to a lot of people, and like the bouncing back and forth, or the panning and all of that sort of stuff, like it really tickles the brain. It's completely random, and I don't say everybody should, like there's these twin brothers that are on TikTok, and they do, one plays drums and the other plays guitar, and they play like 4 minutes straight of mashing up songs,
Oh,
and they switch back and forth like they're wearing different clothes, and it's really, really well done. If anybody's curious, you can reach out to me on Twitter. I'll send it to you. But so that sort of stuff, like mashing up music, like there's like groups on Reddit for like mashing up music, and I think it's
yeah.
like beats per minute, I think is what it's called. Like it's fun. I think the idea of all of this leads to creativity, which segues back into my original, I wanted to get this line of question asking about about DJing, and when you compare it to technical work, like being a programmer, being a developer of sorts, right? There's a ton of creativity, and I would love to kind of hear your thoughts as to, you know, I personally believe that creativity is something that it goes across like all spectrums of work. And in tech, like a lot of people just assume that it's not very artistic and not very creative, even though you talk to anybody in tech, they're either painters or they're DJs or they play guitar or whatever, right? So do you think there's some sort of symbiotic relationship between the creativity of like art and computer science and building things and solving problems?
I think it, I think it is. And I'm no neuroscientist, but I'm
Sure,
sure that
sure.
they're all linked to the same section of the brain because, software development, or at least good software developers, are creative. You're looking at a problem and you're finding a way to solve it. Same thing with DJing. You're finding out, two different songs or three different songs, and kind of tying them together. Same thing with painting. When I was a kid, I still do it now. My notebooks have lots of doodles. I'm always drawing something, to keep my mind I kind of occupied, but it's that whole creativity sign. And, you need to be creative when you're debugging applications too, because you're thinking about all the all the different scenarios that go by, which is why you said like a lot of us that are in software development usually have some other creative side
Mm-hmm.
to us, whether it be software, painting, uh, some kind of music, or other creative means. It's a way of expressing
Yeah.
ourselves, just like software is a way to express yourself.
I can't agree more. And to kind of segue back to kind of your story in tech, I think you realized pretty quickly that there's some money to be made in tech, right? And obviously you had an interest in it. When did you really realize like this is a career? Like this is something that if I put the time in, like I can be fairly successful. I can, pay my the joke is like pay my
Mhm.
JavaScript paid my mortgage or .NET paid my mortgage, right? Like when did you realize like it was an actual career opportunity?
So I think it was after I had my second full-time job with it. My first one, like I said, the one I um, quote unquote lied to get my way
Yeah, yeah.
in. I I worked for that place and I saw what I can do and what I could create. So I started looking at a quote unquote real computer programming job at another place that was basically a contracting shop. They hired software developers to, source out to other companies. I did a lot of back office work
Mm-hmm.
for them. And I started seeing what some of these contractors were making. I'm like, well, this is something I can seriously get my hands into. And then I learned very quickly that I was good at not just software development, but network maintenance, figuring out problems with computer backups, etc. So I really got a foothold into just the computer science ecosystem. And then that's like I told my wife, um, and she was my girlfriend at times, like I think it's ready for us to move on to a real computer programming job and not
Mm-hmm.
these two past two that
Sure.
I had because I was able to one learn a lot on the job, but two figure out that that tie from DJing into computer programming that I have a lot of the same skills or a lot of the same skill sets, so it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah.
And then I got into that and just with my third job, watched my career progression just in that short three 3 year time span or 2 year time span I was at that place.
So in it, and this is I don't want to date you or anything like that, but this is pretty early on in like the I guess the introduction of technology to the masses, right? Like,
Yep.
this is before everybody had a phone in their pocket with the entire internet and all of that, right? Did you kind of think, you know, obviously you lived through like that time and you were, work doing the work. So does it was it something that you had a feeling like this is going to be huge, or was it not until like you were in the middle of it you're like, oh, this is huge? Like when did you realize that like tech was basically essential to the everyday life of most people?
So I think it was kind of the third or fourth job I had, which is back in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, where I started seeing, multiple uses. I went from working at a real estate company to a recruiting slash contracting company to a construction company.
Mm.
And when I got the call about a construction company, I'm like, oh, what could a construction company need with software development? So
Yeah.
starting to see a lot of the behind the scenes stuff with project planning, budgeting, estimating, and things that a computer at the time, Excel and Lotus 1 2 3 would help with, how I could help automate that. And that's when I really saw that a lot of it was changing because I did side contracts for the government while I was working at this place, did a short contract at Princeton University and a couple other places, and saw that so many people were using technology and computer programming that this was the way to go. And then right around that time in the early to mid 90s, the whole Y2K thing was coming up and really
Yeah.
seeing how there were so many systems around the world that could be affected by this, to know that computers and technology are intertwined with our day-to-day life. And like running a bulletin board in the 80s, you knew people wanted to be connected and wanted to have
Yeah.
that access to information.
Was the so you mentioned like the wanting to get together thing just now, and I'm kind of curious, like, so the BBS thing, you know, when when you first started doing that, and like you build this community around it, right? Like people are
Mhm.
joining. This like this is before there was tons of different ways for people to interact with each other, right? Other than calling each other on the
Mhm.
phone. Like when did you realize that like the power of community, like tech, like can accelerate that like developing of community? Was it pretty early on, or was it something like you just notice over time, like, oh, like this tech thing, like it definitely helps connect people that would never typically be connected.
I think some of it was the bulletin board helped because I was able to connect to quite a few people. But in the early early 90s is when I really started seeing it. The first job I got, I was able to get another job as a result of just, me openly talking to people. And at the same time, there was this forum software, MSN, the Microsoft Network. They used to have their own forums similar
Mm-hmm.
to what bulletin boards were that allowed people to communicate. And I got a lot of help when I was initially starting off in Quick Basic at the time from these bulletin boards. And that's where I really saw the power that I didn't have to go to a school or, know a guy who knows a guy or know a girl who knows a girl to be able to gather this knowledge that I
Yeah.
can put out questions to, the internet and people would answer nowadays, back then without the condensation or heavily opinionated answers.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's fascinating to me because I think when depending on when you got started in tech, there are some things that like are I think are kind of standard to like the experience of tech, right? Like,
Yeah.
I like my introduction to technology in general was like Web 2.0. Like, everybody like MySpace pages was like the thing, right? So like immediately we're like, oh, like I want to be able to express myself with my MySpace profile page or whatever, right?
Mhm.
And like it was always there that like, okay, this you go on the internet and there's millions of people there. And I'd imagine that as you're building pieces that are plugged into the internet right at the beginning, right? Like I imagine that you didn't really realize as well, like the amount of impact that you could potentially bring.
No, no, not at all. I mean, nowadays, I hear people, as you and I, we do public speaking, and
Yeah.
one of the benefits are, you get someone that walks up to you at a talk, said, "Hey, I read this blog post on yours and it really helped me," or, going to your talk kind of changed it. Back then, there wasn't a lot of that because it was a very smaller knit community. Um, but there were other ways of thanking people, like, hey, reach out to this person because he or she knows that particular thing. So there was a way to get that acknowledgement. But that's right around when I think a lot of organizations like Microsoft started recognizing people that were helpful because they realized that, within computers, there's lots of ways to help people outside of just, going to, a formal classroom-based training.
Yeah, I probably told you this is the first time I ever met you, right? Like I knew who you were before like I had met you, right? Like I had read blog posts of yours and
Oh,
this the community work that you were doing, like so I'd imagine that occasionally you run into these things where you've been doing it long enough that you meet people that have known quote unquote known you for a long time, right?
yep.
Like tell me how that feels. Like other than like, oh man, I'm getting old because you were like you were in college when in reading my blog post, right? Like,
Yeah.
is there something about you know? Because I think a lot of us that I guess quote unquote create content, we do it for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is to like help educate like the current or future
Yep.
generations, right? Like when did you realize that was important? Like the building community, not just for right now, but for the future.
So I did that very, very early
Yeah.
on. I mean, back in the mid 90s, I realized the value of this, and there was a lot of people around to help, and more so when I moved to Arizona in 2005. Growing up in New York, I had, I built some community by going to user groups and
Hmm.
things like that. And ultimately, when I moved to New York, I didn't have that same community. So I started one for two reasons. One was selfish, I wanted a community so I can,
Yeah.
find jobs and network there. But two, to educate people. I went to school originally to be a high school math teacher. Have the whole necktie and the pocket protector,
Oh,
the
okay.
typical stereotypical 80s teacher look. Uh, but it was my desire to teach people, and I was really good at math. So now I get to do that from a more professional, or not professional, but a better way that unfortunately or fortunately makes more money than a high
Yeah.
school teacher
Yep.
does. Uh, as far as the recognition, it's something that I consider very humbling when someone walks up and says, "Hey, I've known you forever." And that's, one of the challenges with doing public speaking. And I don't want to make this just sound like a humble brag or anything, but
Sure, sure.
sometimes you get to a conference and it's like, oh, like when you and I first met, it's like, oh yeah, I've known you forever. And some people come across like they've literally known you because they've been watching your videos or blog
Hmm.
posts or seen you on there and they feel like they know you, but it's the first time you're actually meeting them. So it's really hard to get to equate those two. But there's nothing better than having someone walk up to you and say, well, thank you for this blog post, or I read this, watch this video and it helped, save my career or save me countless hours
Yeah.
of troubleshooting. That's one of the primary reasons why I do it. One of the things I always tell people when I interview for a job, I have, you know, one real rule or motto in my life, and that's to leave the world better than it was
Yeah.
when I got here. So I do a lot of that through my public education and speaking at conferences or writing blog posts or, doing chats like this, mentoring people, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I can only speak for myself as somebody who has had the opportunity to meet a lot of people um, that kind of helped me, like early in career, finding out what I wanted to do in tech. And it's always a very, very weird experience when you meet that person, like in person for the first time, because
Yeah.
like it's not like you're meeting somebody and you don't know anything about them, right? You know their name, you know where, in some cases, you know where they live, like you know their career history, you
Yep.
know kind of their sense of humor, and it's very, very strange to like start a relationship when one side already has started the relationship, right?
Yeah.
uh, it's just it's fascinating to me because I've seen it plenty of times where I'll be standing with like you or somebody like Magnus or somebody else who's been around for Magnus Martinson for people who care. I just threw out his name. Like people who have been in tech for a long time, and I'll be having a chat with them, and then somebody will walk up and then just start having a conversation like one person has known this person for a long time, and you'll
Yeah.
walk away and that's like, oh, I guess that was cool. Like, because I
Yeah.
think one of the things, if especially if you're a public speaker and you can kind of put your 2 cents into this, is that like you do have a lot of transactional type of interactions with people. Like, you deliver a talk, or maybe you answer a question after a talk, or you meet at a happy hour, or whatever, right? Or you respond to somebody on Twitter, right? Like if you're
Mhm.
somewhat known, you have a lot of these transactional type of relationships. And the question that I'm curious to get your thoughts on is like, how much interaction does it take for you to be kind of lasting? Because obviously you don't remember every single person you've had a conversation with. Like,
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I was in Stockholm last week. I think it was last week, maybe the week before. And some of the speakers were talking about the same subject.
mm-hmm,
You know, I am terrible with names. It
mm-hmm,
usually takes me one or two times. Like there was a speaker that I introduced myself to in Stockholm. It's like, Joe, we met at the MVP summit,
yeah,
a month ago. I'm like,
yeah,
so sorry. You get a lot of people, I'm old and everything, as you kindly put it before. So it's
No.
hard to remember. Um, I think it really, for me, it depends on two things, like the level of transactions that we have. Like if it's semi-frequent on LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook or something, then I'll tend to remember. For me, it's kind of like I have to meet you two or three times before it like really sinks in, unless we're having heavy interactions.
Hmm.
We actually have a funny story. There was an MVP, a former MVP. He's no longer an MVP, but we used to have this exchange. The second time we met, I introduced myself to him. It's like, "Hey, I'm Joe." He's like, "Hey, I'm Dave." And this was the second time. Third time, he did the same thing to me. And it's like, "Hey, Joe, I'm Dave." And we honestly didn't remember that we met each other.
Yeah.
So the fourth time, it became a joke with us. Now, every time we see each other, we would reintroduce ourselves to each other as kind of our stick. And everyone's like, "Don't you guys know each other?" I was like, "Yeah, we do, but the first two or three times we forgot." So we mutually tease each other. But
Yeah.
I think the importance to remember is not necessarily from a speaker standpoint, but more so from a other user, whether you're a reader of a blog or a podcast or a video cast or what have you, is that having someone not remember you is not as significant as you may think. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with you. Uh, Scott Hanselman, one time, him and I were having a conversation. He told me, I'm nowhere near on the level he has, but he can do 3,000, 4,000 interactions with people a month. He can go to a conference and see
Yeah.
a bunch of people. Unfortunately, we're not going to remember every person. And it takes that two or three times to build that relationship before you get to know everyone. So don't be discouraged because, hey, you may have introduced yourself to Isaac two times before he remembered your name, or me three times before I remembered your name. It's just there's a lot of people coming in and we're not seeing you as much to be able to tie the name to the face, or especially if you have like a different Twitter handle than your
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
name. You might know someone as debugger 42 as opposed to their name.
Yeah, no, I have a similar story. For folks watching this in the future, this is like the end of May 2024. Microsoft Build, which is like Microsoft's big conference, was last week, and I was there, and I was chatting at like the attendee party, and I was having a chat with somebody that I've known for a very very long time, and we were chatting, and there was another individual there, and he looked super familiar, but I couldn't place him. And I said, oh, I probably just met him at a conference or something. And I was like, oh, I'm Isaac, by the way. And he's like, oh, yeah, yeah, we've met like 5 times. And and
It
and
happens.
I just felt just demoralized because I used to pride myself on kind of remembering everybody, and I think that it's starting to slip a little bit. And it's just one of those things where, it's weird to like that what you said earlier, like the humble bragging. Like it's not like, oh, I meet so many people and I'm so famous that like I can't remember. But it's like, no, I think you get to a point where a lot of faces kind of blend together, not in a bad way, just
Yeah.
especially if you have very like surface level conversation with them. Like if I sit down and have a 10-minute conversation with you, 15-minute conversation with you, I'm probably not going to forget who you are. But if
Yeah.
I say hi and we talk about the weather, or oh, this is a nice conference, like where are you coming from, like that's probably not going to sit in my long-term memory.
Yep.
So, we talked a little bit about like this community thing, and like, talked about public speaking a little bit. And to be fair, like I first found out about you through, Ineta, which, for folks who have been around for a bit, like it was kind of like the first kind of like .NET open source community sort of organization, right? Um, and Joe was a part of it. And I'd love to get your thoughts, as somebody who was in .NET, the .NET community early on, before all of the great things that have happened in the .NET ecosystem since. Like, what was it like, .NET gets announced in 20 in what 2001 or 2002 or something
Yep.
like that. Like, what was it like early on as a .NET developer, and what was it like, especially being like a community person in that ecosystem when things were a bit more closed and not as accessible for everybody?
Yeah, so for those that don't know, INETA that he's referring to stands for the International .NET Association. It was created by Microsoft and a couple other component vendors to kind of help spread the word about .NET because .NET was relatively new. It was Microsoft's forte into kind of having a single combined uh, IL or instructional language for software developers to get away from the whole C++ or DOS days or Visual Basic for Windows, kind of have a unified platform. So they created this group as a way to help spread the word. And they had public speakers that went out. As a user group leader, you can request people to go out and speak at your events. You can get the Scott Hanselmans, the Carl Franklins, Richard Campbell's to come to your group. And it was really effective because it helped to spread the word around .NET. And um, some of these speakers, actually most of these speakers in that community, were given some advanced bits into what was coming out so they could prepare themselves to be able to talk. So like when Windows 7 came out, they were given preview bits of Windows 7 in some
Mm,
cases, the hardware to talk about it. When Windows 95 came out, they were given the advanced bits so they can start playing and learning about it. And it was really great. I got invited to that community by uh, the president at the time, Rob Zell. He wanted me to handle marketing because he watched how quote quote unquote quickly I rose in the .NET world from no one knowing me to people knowing me all throughout the country. So he wanted me help with the marketing team
sure.
on that. So I helped out with marketing for a bit and then moved into the presidency to kind of help keep that organization moving forward. But it was a really good tool to help spread the word and get other speakers out there because you get some of the small towns, like I'm going to mention a town and probably aggravate someone, but like Boise, Idaho, that probably doesn't have a lot of big public speakers there, but they can start pulling in, the
Yeah,
big names to that group, which helps expand it and grow. And that was one of the real benefits of, you know, the program. Fortunately, like many, uh, it hit its usefulness after a while, and
yeah,
.NET was already super strong and wasn't needed anymore, so we shut it down.
yeah. So, what are some of the things that you learned, because you mentioned like this is the beginning of .NET and like you know, there wasn't a huge community, and eventually now it's a very large community. Like,
Yep.
what were some of the things that you recognized pretty quickly that were shared amongst like the broader community related to .NET? Just genuinely curious. Like, as somebody who I think like the first like I started like I had to maintain like older .NET framework apps when I got started in career, but I think like when I graduated college, my first job was like on .NET 2.0. But like I had to manage stuff before that. Like, initially, what was the general community or I guess user base like perception of .NET?
I think in the beginning, especially in the .NET framework days, so pre .NET Core, which is now just .NET, uh, it was it was thought that the Microsoft .NET framework was more the 9 to 5 corporate developer, that it
Mm,
wasn't something that should be used or was something that could be used by like the startups or freelancers because it
sure.
was strictly tied to Windows and you only had that Windows to use it. It was way before it was .NET and cross-platform. And there was a lot of stigmatism to using Microsoft products back then because, they weren't friendly. They were this huge company. Not that Java wasn't huge at the time, or
Sure.
C++ was always thought also in the very beginning that some of the languages were like the the lesser of like the C++
Sure.
or Visual Basic or things like that. And a lot of people originally thought that like C sharp was a direct copy of Java,
Mm-hmm.
which, if you look at it from the surface level, yes, but the way it works behind the scenes,
Sure.
it's very different between the two. So there was a big branding problem, which is one of the things that, you know, .NET and, open source started changing. And when we moved into .NET Core in the early 2000s, a lot of that started to change. Nowhere near what it is today, but there
Yeah.
was still a lot of that hurdles of, oh, it's Microsoft, so it's only Windows. And it's still a lot of people believe that even with, .NET 8 that's out, that you still need a Windows PC to do development with it. And you only have to buy Microsoft products to do development with it. And it's sadly not true
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
Fortunately, not
Yeah.
true anymore, but sad that people still believe
Sure.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I was following you. It, so I totally, the open source thing is fascinating to me because, you know, if you look at all of the main programming languages that people use, right? Like how many of them don't have like some large tech company that sits on top of them in some way and kind of steers the ship, right? It just for whatever reason, like because of history or whatever, that like Microsoft owning a programming language or a opinionated framework on how to build applications is a bad thing.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, pretty much everyone does.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
Java, Golang, Rust, Python, they all have a large organization that's behind them.
yeah. You mentioned open source, like so. You know, when when did open source like when did you realize like first off like what open source software was to an extent, right? And and secondly, like when did you realize that it was going to be this enormous thing that has kind of taken all of the attention for like the modern application development?
Oof, that was probably 2005 to 8, maybe, right around when I started working at one of the companies and we were looking at different ways of doing it. Plus, as a Microsoft MVP, getting some insider info that, hey, we're going to start looking at opening up our source. And at the time, I didn't know what that meant. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of people think, oh, it's open source. That just means it's free for me to, copy and reuse, as opposed to, that the software is open for anyone to use, assuming you're abiding by the licenses. Uh, I think it got really big once Microsoft started opening up uh, the .NET Core source, so to speak,
Sure.
and then followed up by Windows, meaning, hey, if we're an open book now, we're not hiding anything from people. And I think a lot of people started seeing the benefits, not so much that, oh, it's Microsoft doing it, but the general gist behind it of, hey, we're all sharing this, how we solve problems. Maybe there's a better way of doing it that we haven't seen. By all means, contribute to it. I mean, I have a couple of open source libraries, nothing big. I think
Sure.
two of them have had a couple of contributions to outside of me, but it's super helpful to see how, projects like Avalonia and others have grown because they open up source and other people can contribute to it. Uh, and I don't like to think of it as free software development,
Yeah.
but more so getting other eyes in on it and making things better. I think most people want to contribute to society. Not everyone could be a public speaker. Not everyone could be a great artist or a teacher or fire person or a police person. Um, some people are really good at writing software, and their way to
Yeah.
give back is to contribute to other products and help that. Things like Hacktoberfest really help get people out there. Because you probably a lot of software engineers are not introverts or are not
Sure.
extroverts, they're
Sure.
introverts. So
Yeah.
it's harder for them to do that public speaking and outreach. So having open source software allows people to be able to contribute and give back without putting themselves proverbially out there for others in awkwardly social situations for most.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Like and it is pretty wild to think like because I think we both know people that are to put it lightly, they're maniacs. Like they can just write code that's so performant, it's so effective, it does the job, and they just have like all of these different projects that all these different people use, right? And I just don't have that. Like I'm similar to you. Like I have a couple of like open source things that people have used and some people haven't used or whatever. Like I don't I'm not trying to get famous from open source software, but like there are definitely people that have gotten they built their entire careers on top of like, oh, I
Yep.
can build projects and I have this really deep understanding of what's needed in different areas, and I'll just build a thing to solve a problem. I've been more on the how does like what can Isaac do to help some other company make money track, I guess, which whatever. Um,
Same thing with me.
yeah, right. But I'd love to get your thoughts too. Is like as somebody who does you are out there, you do talk to a lot of people, at conferences and what have you. Like, is the is open source something that is a good gateway for folks to get started in tech, or is it a distraction for the main reason why most people are in tech, and that is to make money?
I think it's a really good gateway for two reasons. One is you can see how a lot of people write software, good, right, wrong, or indifferent. Some people write good software, some people just don't. They write stuff that gets things done, but it might not be the most uh, maintainable or readable. So it's a really good way to get it. And some people are like me that like to learn by actually doing, meaning
Mm-hmm.
I'll
Yep.
download an open source project to learn, like, let's just say, Azure Bicep. I'll download it to figure out what it does and tweak it. That's how I learn
Mm-hmm.
how something does. So it's really helpful for that. The other thing that's really helpful to get your uh, foot into a door at a lot of places. A lot of places nowadays are looking at GitHub profiles of people to see what they're coding, what their
Yeah.
code style looks like, and what they contribute. You don't have to have a plethora of open source projects, but some GitHub activity that people can see what you do. It's an easier way in than your typical phone screening, which you ask a bunch of questions that most people know the answers to
Sure.
because they've read it online or are good at taking tests.
Yep.
This allows people to see your creativity.
Yeah, I agree. But I do struggle sometimes where the beauty of open source is also kind of like the crux of open source is that like there's so much stuff out there that you can sometimes get lost. Like I can name, off the top of my head, like at least 10 times where I've gone down this rabbit hole of trying to figure out how to solve a problem, find a project, do the thing that you're talking about, download the project, get it to build, do all the things, and then to realize, like, oh, it doesn't do exactly what I want.
Yep.
And, like, not to say that's a bad thing, because I think everybody has the right to have some opinionated way to do things.
Yep.
But if I'm trying to solve a problem, and, maybe, like, to use my example earlier, maybe I'm just trying to make somebody else money and if I'm spending a whole day like trying to get like this npm package to work in my solution and it doesn't end up working the way I want it to, like I've kind of lost a day. So
Yep.
are there tricks that you found that kind of streamline that process to it a bit? Are you just okay with a little bit of like wasted time and effort and pain and all of that just because it's part of the experience?
So, yes, it's part of the experience, but I think some of it is also, learning. Like you said, let's just use logging for an example, because there's nlog, there's serial log, there's log for .NET. There's a new one every other day, kind of like JavaScript frameworks. And they all have their own way of solving the problem. So the way I look at it is, yes, I may download Log4net and take a day or two to figure out how to configure it and realize it doesn't do what I need. So I'm going to go to something like Serial Log and do the same thing. And while that 2 days may look wasted, it's only wasted if you got nothing out of it. So like
Sure.
for me, it's a comparison of, well, this engineer thought that this was a good way to solve this particular problem or these particular scenarios, where this developer thought it was this way, and look at the patterns he or she or them followed versus the patterns he or she or them followed here. So I use it as a learning experience. If you're just going through and spitting through something like, oh, I'm going to download the Telerik controls and try to use them. Oh no, they stink. I'm going to go and download the Dev Express. No, they stink. I'm going to go and download, XYZ components. And, if you're just going to go through that, then you're not learning. And then your job, you're really what, consider the quote unquote 9 to 5 developer, that you're just in it for, clocking, clocking in and clocking out versus trying to really understand and perfect your craft.
Yeah. No, I mean, I can't agree with anything you just said more. Like it's about like one of the things that I think is essential to being successful in quotes in tech is like
Mhm.
is understanding like when to pick your spots.
Yep.
Like because I think I've told this story on this show a few times. Like my first job, I was working with like two like very senior developers. Like one was an O'Reilly author, so like people that had like that knew their stuff, right? And I remember one of these gentlemen like staring at like one line of code, and it felt like were staring at that one line of code for
To your
day.
soul.
Yeah, for no, I swear, I felt like they were staring at that one line of code for days, like 2 or 3 days. Like, and this is, they're trying to get something to work and like it wasn't working and they tried all these different things. And I remember like eventually, like when he solved the problem, like he's like, that's it, I'm done, and just left. Like, because he recognized that like he wasn't going to be any more productive the rest of the day than he was at that exact moment because he got whatever his thing done. And obviously, like he just went and took like a lunch break or whatever it was, and he came back. But like, um, I recognize very very quickly like that there is a lot of I use the phrase pain. It's probably not the best word to use, but like there's a lot of pain or struggle like in being a software developer, be a technologist in
Yep.
general. And I tell people that are getting started, like you have to be okay with it because like the payoff is worth it.
Yep.
Like in every facet of the word, right? Like, uh, you know, I could probably ask you, like Joe, like, do you remember a time like when you solved a problem and it was like the best feeling that you've had for like months? And you're
Yeah,
like,
and they
oh,
normally happen at like 2:30 in the morning when you wake up and
yeah,
your
yeah,
brain's figuring something out for you.
yeah. Or like you're in the car driving, or like you're in the shower and like you have no
Yep.
access to a computer, and you're like, oh no, no. I had a, I knew somebody in college that would like write code on the bus, like they because he's like there's just some things that just came to me like randomly, and I just would
Yep.
just even if it wasn't like the exact syntax, like just writing the ideas down to get them out of your head. Like it reminds me of this Keith Richards story. Keith Richards is the guitarist for the Rolling Stones, and they have a song called "Can't Get No Satisfaction," which is thought of as like one of the greatest songs in rock and roll history. And the story is that like he woke up in the middle of the night and recorded like the guitar riff for that song, and he woke up the next day and the tape recorder or whatever it was at the time was next to him, and he played it, and it's 15 seconds of the riff to get no satisfaction, and then like 2 hours of snoring. And when I hear that, I think it's like, yeah, like it's totally like that. Things just come to you, and you have to be able to, if you can't immediately implement them, you have to figure out a way to memorialize them because you'll probably forget them the second you get to your desk.
Yep. It's an acquired skill to realize, walking away from code. It's one of the things I've always talked to quote unquote junior developers on is it's okay to walk away. If you're struggling with the problem, you're staring at it for more than half hour, hour, take a lunch break or go and do something else. Because while you're away, your brain in the background is going through that problem. And a lot of times you'll get the aha moment on a bus or when you're in the shower or stuff. It's really key. Your brain is incredible how it processes data in the background for us.
Yeah,
Most people don't realize that. It's like, no, I have to figure out this problem. I have to solve it. A lot of times it's just better to walk away.
slamming your head against something usually isn't the resolution or the solution to anything.
Yep.
Um, Now, as we start to wrap up, like this has been a really great conversation, Joe. I've enjoyed kind of getting to know your thoughts around these different topics. And one of the things that I'd love to kind of like end our conversation on is like this idea of like what you see the tech community in general like evolving into over time. Like right now, I think there's a hyper focus on things like AI and all these different um, scareware of like our jobs are changing and our jobs are disappearing. And as somebody that's been doing this for a bit, like this is not the first or the last time that some interrupter will make us all freak out. So like what are some of the things that you think of that like, oh, this is definitely going to stick around, or what how do you see the tech community in the next 3 years? I know that's a crazy amount of time, but I'm curious as to your
Yeah.
thoughts.
I agree that, a lot of people get panicked with disruptors. When Windows 3.1 came out, everyone was like, no, why would I ever need to do two things at one time with a computer?
Yeah.
Then when Vista came out, why would I need to do this? Same thing with .NET and everything. There's always going to be those disruptors. A good software engineer is going to learn to adapt. And I agree with you, AI, code pilots, what have you, are not going to replace software engineers. Computers, at least in the next 3 years or 10 years, are nowhere near as creative as human beings. But they provide us with tools to help us learn how to do our jobs better and more efficiently. Like, I got on the Copilot quote unquote bandwagon 2 years ago when private previews came out. And I actually wrote a blog post of
Yeah.
how Copilot helped me write this blog post. And again, it was the
Yeah.
help, not did the blog post, because we
Sure.
still need to provide the creative ideas. So I think, in the future, we're going to see a lot still around AI and how it could help us. Same thing around, still cryptocurrency is still going to be a big thing. But I think one of the largest things going to be out is how we interact with computers are going to be very different in the
Mm-hmm.
near future. Virtual reality is going to become more of a thing, but like how we go about querying for data. So nowadays we type one or two words in Google or Bing and hope for the best. Now we're going to go to a different tool like, Copilot or Gemini or, you fill in the blank and ask it where it's going to be hopefully smart enough to be able to help us get that. But again, those are the tools to
Yeah.
get us. When Stack Overflow came out, it didn't stop software development. It was just another
Yeah.
tool we have to copy bad software and paste it into our
Sure.
apps.
Sure. Yeah, you said something that like very like the whole like the Gemini thing, very top of mind at the moment for folks listening in the future. Like Gemini recently like added like AI, or Google recently added like AI powered search results to Gemini, and like it's causing a lot of interesting conversations online about like
Yep.
if you're searching for an answer, do you really want AI to recommend what the answer is because of how AIs are these LLMs are
Yep.
built? Like, it's not 100% guaranteed that you're getting the right answer, right? Like there is a level of quality to the answer because it's trained, but at the end of the day, it's not like asking Joe, "Hey Joe, what's your birthday?" Like if I
Yep.
was to ask Gemini what Joe's birthday is, it might not be. the answer
Well,
every single time.
yeah, but Google probably knows what my birthday is, which
Sure,
is this
that's fair.
Friday, by the way.
Yeah. Oh well, happy early birthday. That's very random and also very cool. This conversation's been great. Like I think thinking about tech community in general is fascinating to me because I've kind of, for good, bad, or indifferent, I've kind of stamped my flag or put my flag into like making sure and trying to be a part of the community and trying to make sure that tech is better, like you were saying earlier, like better in the future than it is now. We've talked about a lot of topics. Like we've talked obviously about how you got started and your different ebbs and flows through being an engineer and working with the community. If you could kind of think about the last hour of conversation we've had, but you've only had a word or two to summarize it, what would that word be or words be for you?
Word or two is hard, but a
You can
sentence
cheat. You can
is
cheat. You can use a sentence. I used to be very stringent on the one word thing. I do it every show, and people are just like, ah. And then I have like, it's bad. It's bad podcast for people to be silent for like 35 seconds too.
yeah,
So like,
no,
summarize it any way
I
you'd like, sir.
I can do it in 2 words,
Sure.
or three. Always be learning, because if you want to be successful in this field, you're always learning. I mean, I started, like I said, in Quick Basic, you know, 30 years ago, and now I'm leading an entire technology team for an organization because I'm always learning
Yeah.
and always willing to admit that I don't know everything.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
mostly because I'm married and my wife tells me so. So
Well, it's good to stay ground. It's still good to stay grounded, right? Like having
because
somebody in your life who just says like, no, no. And I think everybody appreciates a partner that can set them on the right path, and
yep,
I can't disagree with that. And I've really appreciated this conversation. This has been great for folks that,
me too.
yeah. So for folks that want to follow Joe, if you're not already doing that, there'll be a lot of lists to different places you can follow him in the show notes. But probably one of the best places is on Twitter. You can follow him at Joe Guadagno. So that's Jguadagno. And like I said, there'll be some links to some other places in the show notes. Before we part, do you have any things you'd like to throw in there? Things you'd like to say?
Uh, no, I can't think of anything. I think we covered a lot of.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not to put you on the spot, like summarize this entire thing, right? And then like, oh, also by the way, what are some takeaways, right? Like, yeah. No, but this has been great. Like, I really appreciate it, and thank you so much for your time, Joe. It's always great to chat with people like not in other countries too. Like, usually for folks that are listening, whenever I see Joe, it's like in Oslo or Sweden or whatever, right? And it's like, okay, like maybe we can actually have a conversation, like virtually, but we're both in the States.
It's
Um,
funny. I have a friend of mine who's a public speaker who literally lives a half a mile down the road from me, and I
yeah,
only see him at conferences.
yeah, yeah. That's that. I mean, that's not very rare. I mean, especially like in the after times, like who really goes
Yeah,
outside anyway, right? Um,
yeah.
This has been great. Thank you so much, Joe, for being on the show and chatting with me. And thanks for the folks that are listening live and for the folks that are listening in the future. So my name is Isaac Levin, and this has been Coffee and Open Source, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.